Welcome back to our final episode of Empire Reimagined, Power and Politics in the 21st Century. I'm Kaede, and over the past 5 episodes, we've traced the evolution of imperialism from territorial conquest to financial domination, a transformation that's made empire more subtle but no less powerful. Today, we're peering into the crystal ball at emerging imperial trends that will shape the next decade of global power politics. Spoiler alert. The future of imperialism looks less like armies marching across borders, and more like algorithms determining what information you consume, corporations controlling the water you drink, and superpowers fighting over who gets to write the code that runs our digital lives. What makes our current moment particularly fascinating and terrifying is how imperial ambitions are adapting to challenges that transcend traditional geopolitics. Climate change isn't just an environmental crisis, it's an imperial opportunity. As regions become uninhabitable, water grows scarce, and agricultural patterns shift, powerful nations are positioning themselves to control what author Christian Parenti calls the politics of the armed lifeboat, essentially deciding who gets resources and who doesn't in a climate-changed world. And they're doing this while simultaneously embracing nationalist rhetoric that rejects global cooperation on the very problems they're positioning themselves to exploit. Throughout this episode, we'll examine 3 major frontiers of emerging imperialism: climate imperialism, technological imperialism, and social media influence operations, and how these interact with the multipolar contest between established and rising powers. We'll also explore resistance movements gaining traction and alternatives emerging from both the global south and unexpected quarters of the global north. Because if there's anything our journey through modern imperialism has taught us, it's that empire always evolves, always claims benevolent intentions, and always faces resistance. The only question is whether we can recognize the pattern quickly enough to respond effectively. Let's begin with the newest imperial battlefield, the contest for who controls our rapidly changing climate future. Climate imperialism might sound like a contradiction. How can you colonize something as universal as the changing atmosphere? But look closer at the responses of powerful nations to our planetary crisis, and a disturbing pattern emerges. Rather than addressing root causes, imperial powers are positioning themselves to control adaptation resources, particularly water, arable land, and climate-resilient technologies. By 2025, 6 major powers have secured water rights in 42 drought-vulnerable countries, often through opaque contracts buried in development assistance packages. When Egypt signed its 2023 Climate Adaptation Agreement with the U.S., the fine print included provisions giving American corporations priority access to Nile water resources during scarcity events. A phrase that conveniently lacks precise definition, but effectively subordinates Egyptian water sovereignty to foreign interests during crises. The disturbing genius of climate imperialism lies in how it transforms a global crisis into an opportunity for domination, while simultaneously appearing to offer solutions. Consider the European Union's Green Border Adjustment Mechanism, which imposes carbon taxes on imports from developing nations with insufficient climate policies. On paper, it's environmentally responsible. In practice, it's a form of climate colonialism that ignores the EU's historical emissions while punishing countries that haven't yet industrialized. The numbers tell the story. By 2025, the mechanism will extract an estimated $27 billion annually from global South economies, while exempting 86% of historical emitters from comparable penalties. This isn't climate justice. It's green imperialism disguised as environmental responsibility. Perhaps most insidiously, climate imperialism operates through technical control of adaptation technologies, creating dependency relationships around the tools necessary for survival in a changing world. When a consortium of Western agricultural corporations secured patents on 73% of drought-resistant crop varieties developed by 2025, they effectively gained control over who can grow food in increasingly arid regions. Similarly, when desalination technology, potentially life-saving in water-scarce regions, remains concentrated in the hands of corporations from just 3 countries, water access becomes a new vector of imperial control. As one Kenyan environmental minister put it, first they caused the climate crisis through their emissions, then they patented the solutions, and now they're selling us the keys to our own survival at prices we can't afford. The colonial administrator with a pith helmet has been replaced by the climate tech consultant with a sustainability certification, but the fundamental dynamic remains distressingly familiar. Technological imperialism represents perhaps the most comprehensive form of domination yet devised, a system where control is exercised not just over territory or resources, but over the digital infrastructure that increasingly constitutes modern life itself. When 5 American tech companies control platforms used by 4.7 billion people worldwide, we're witnessing unprecedented concentration of power operating across borders without formal imperial structures. These entities don't just dominate markets, they establish governance frameworks that shape behavior globally while remaining fundamentally unaccountable to most of the populations they influence. By 2025, Google's content moderation decisions affect more people than any government's laws, yet the company answers primarily to shareholders rather than citizens, a stark example of private imperial power operating beyond democratic constraints. The battle for technological supremacy between the US and China has created dueling technological empires that force other nations into vassalage relationships disguised as strategic partnerships. When the Biden administration pressured 32 countries to adopt American 5G standards while excluding Chinese providers between 2021 to 2025, it wasn't merely promoting competition. It was establishing technological sovereignty over critical infrastructure. Similarly, when China's Digital Silk Road Initiative installed telecommunications networks in 47 African nations by 2025, complete with surveillance capabilities and data sharing requirements, it wasn't simply offering development assistance. It was creating digital tributaries bound to Beijing through technological dependency. The colonial competition for territorial control has evolved into a scramble for digital dominance, with much of the world forced to choose between competing imperial systems. Most concerning is how technological imperialism operates through apparently neutral technical standards and protocols that disguise power relationships beneath layers of code. When the US-dominated International Organization for Standardization established protocols for artificial intelligence development in 2024, they embedded Western ethical frameworks that privileged individual privacy over communal rights, effectively imposing specific cultural values through seemingly objective technical requirements. Similarly, when Chinese surveillance systems exported to 76 nations by 2025 prioritized social harmony over personal expression, they implemented a distinctly Chinese value system through ostensibly neutral technology. The genius of technological imperialism lies in its invisibility. Most people never see the imperial frameworks encoded into the devices they use daily, making resistance particularly difficult. As technology theorist Evgeny Morozov noted, the most effective form of power is that which doesn't need to announce itself. Social media platforms represent the pinnacle of contemporary imperial power, systems that shape public consciousness, political discourse, and consumer behavior across borders, without requiring formal territorial control. When TikTok's algorithm determines what content 1.7 billion users see globally by 2025, we're witnessing an unprecedented capacity to influence without explicit coercion. The platform's parent company, ByteDance, implements content policies shaped by Chinese regulatory preferences while simultaneously adjusting to Western demands, creating what media scholar Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism with distinctly imperial characteristics. The competition isn't just commercial but geopolitical, with foreign policy implications so significant that the US government attempted to force TikTok's sale in 2020 and again in 2024, recognizing that whoever controls the algorithms controls the narrative. The imperial nature of social media dominance becomes particularly evident when examining content moderation decisions that systematically favor imperial center perspectives. Research published in 2025 demonstrated that content critical of U.S. foreign policy was 57% more likely to be algorithmically suppressed than similar content criticizing Chinese policies on American platforms, while Chinese platforms showed the exact opposite bias. Similarly, indigenous language content receives 74% less algorithmic promotion than English content across major platforms, despite serving communities with equal engagement levels. These aren't neutral technical decisions, but imperial choices that privilege certain perspectives and languages while marginalizing others, creating digital hierarchies that mirror colonial power structures with disturbing precision. The battle for social media dominance has created new forms of information warfare that make traditional propaganda seem quaint by comparison. When Russian influence operations targeted 17 African elections between 2023 to 2025, they weren't merely spreading misinformation, but exploiting platform algorithms to maximize divisive content exposure, effectively weaponizing the attention economy against democratic processes. Similarly, when American tech companies adjusted their algorithms following the 2024 U.S. election to prioritize authoritative sources, they were exporting specific definitions of authority and legitimacy globally. The colonial power that once controlled education systems to shape colonized minds has evolved into the technological power that controls information flows, determining what billions see, believe, and consequently how they act. As media scholar Safia Noble observed, algorithms are opinions embedded in code. And increasingly, those opinions reflect imperial perspectives masked as objective technology. The emerging multipolar imperial contest doesn't challenge imperialism itself, but merely diversifies its practitioners, creating competing empires rather than challenging imperial dynamics. Conservative nationalism provides the ideological fuel for this competition across dramatically different political systems. When Putin justifies Russian aggression through appeals to historical Russian greatness and traditional values, when Xi promotes the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, or when Trump campaigned on America First in 2024, they were all drawing from the same conservative nationalist playbook that has historically justified imperial ambitions. The consistency is remarkable. Conservative nationalist rhetoric accounted for 83% of imperial justifications across all major powers by 2025, regardless of whether those powers were democratic, authoritarian, capitalist, or nominally communist. This ideological convergence around conservative nationalism accelerated dramatically following the 2024 U.S. election, which conservative nationalists worldwide portrayed as validating their approach. When Brazilian President Bolsonaro declared in January 2025 that liberal globalism is dead, while announcing expanded Amazon development, he wasn't merely making a domestic policy statement, but positioning Brazil within an emerging conservative nationalist bloc. Similarly, when India's BJP government cited traditional values, while implementing internet control mechanisms in March 2025, they were drawing from the same ideological well as Russia's sovereign internet and China's cyber sovereignty. All conservative nationalist frameworks that justify controlling information flows based on purported threats to national tradition, security, or values. What makes this convergence particularly consequential is how it reconfigures imperial competition around civilizational blocks, rather than individual nations or universal values. When Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov articulated the Russian world concept in February 2025, expanding it beyond Russian speakers to include all those who share traditional values, he wasn't merely defining Russian interests, but establishing an ideological empire explicitly opposed to Western liberalism. Similarly, when China hosted the Global Civilization Initiative Summit in April 2025, inviting 73 countries to discuss alternatives to Western hegemony. It wasn't simply promoting diplomatic cooperation, but constructing an imperial alternative organized around conservative principles of hierarchy, tradition, and order. The liberal international order, established after World War II, isn't being replaced by a more just system. It's being challenged by competing imperial orders equally committed to domination, but justified through different forms of conservative nationalism. Perhaps the most intriguing development in modern imperial politics is the emergence of conservative anti-imperialism, a perspective that opposes imperial projects not from progressive principles, but from traditionalist ones. Conservative thinker Russell Kirk warned in his foundational work, The Conservative Mind, 1953, that a nation that becomes an empire soon loses the virtues that made it great. A sentiment increasingly echoed by contemporary conservatives disillusioned with the endless wars and interventions of the past decades. By 2025, this perspective has evolved into a coherent critique articulated by figures like political philosopher Patrick Denning, whose The End of Liberal Imperialism, 2022, argued that both progressive liberalism and neoconservative interventionism represented two sides of the same imperial coin, both imposing universal values on societies with different traditions and priorities. This conservative anti-imperialism gained significant traction following the 2024 U.S. election, with the incoming administration facing unexpected resistance from within its own ideological camp to proposed interventions abroad. When Secretary of State nominee Richard Grenell argued in February 2025 that American values aren't universal and we should stop pretending they are, he was articulating a distinctly conservative rejection of imperial universalism that crossed traditional political boundaries. Similarly, when conservative commentator Tucker Carlson's April 2025 interview with Iranian President Raisi drew 47 million viewers, the largest audience for any political interview that year, it represented a significant shift in conservative willingness to engage with nations typically portrayed as enemies in imperial narratives. The paradox of conservative anti-imperialism lies in its simultaneous rejection of imperial projects abroad while often embracing nationalist frameworks that preserve hierarchies at home. Conservative critics of American empire rarely extend their critique to domestic power structures or economic arrangements that maintain inequality, creating what political scientist Samuel Goldman calls parochial anti-imperialism that opposes foreign adventures while accepting domestic dominance. When conservative anti-imperialists joined progressive activists in opposing the March 2025 Panama intervention, they did so for fundamentally different reasons. Progressives objecting to American domination of Panama, conservatives objecting to the overseas commitment of American resources. This creates temporary alliances that rarely extend to domestic policy questions, where the commitment to traditional hierarchies typically reasserts itself. Yet despite these limitations, conservative anti-imperialism represents a significant development in imperial politics, potentially constraining future imperial projects by removing the bipartisan consensus that has traditionally enabled them. While conservative anti-imperialism represents an ideological challenge within imperial centers, the most practical resistance to modern imperialism emerges from the global South, where communities experience imperial power most directly. The Kenya-led debt strike coalition that formed in January 2024, eventually encompassing 17 African nations, collectively refusing further payments on Chinese infrastructure loans, represents a particularly significant development. By coordinating their actions, these nations transformed what would have been individual weakness into collective leverage, forcing China to renegotiate terms rather than risk simultaneous defaults across multiple belt and road projects. When Kenyan President Ruto declared that predatory loans are not development assistance, He wasn't merely making a policy statement, but articulating a fundamental challenge to the financial mechanisms of modern imperialism. Digital sovereignty movements represent another crucial front in Global South resistance to imperial control. When Indonesia implemented its Data Localization Act in March 2025, requiring all citizen data to be stored on servers physically located within Indonesian territory, it directly challenged the extraction model of digital imperialism that treats Global South data as a resource to be harvested and processed elsewhere. Similarly, when Brazil's digital cooperative movement expanded to encompass 17 million users by 2025, creating community-owned alternatives to corporate platforms, it established practical alternatives to dependence on northern technological systems. These initiatives don't merely resist external control, but build alternative infrastructures that reduce vulnerability to imperial leverage, transforming theoretical sovereignty into practical independence. Perhaps most significantly, South-South cooperation has accelerated dramatically as nations seek to escape bilateral dependency relationships with traditional imperial powers. The BRICS financial architecture, established in 2024, creating alternatives to the US-dominated SWIFT system and IMF, represents a structural challenge to Western financial hegemony. By 2025, 32 countries had joined the expanded BRICS payment system, reducing their vulnerability to Western financial sanctions and creating space for policy autonomy previously constrained by Northern financial institutions. Similarly, when the Africa-led Digital Commons Initiative, launched in February 2025, creating open-source alternatives to proprietary Western and Chinese technologies, it established practical tools for technological autonomy. These systems don't necessarily abolish imperial dynamics completely. Larger global South powers often reproduce imperial relationships with smaller neighbors. But they do diversify dependency relationships and create negotiating leverage previously unavailable to many nations. Imperial powers haven't remained passive in the face of resistance. They've developed increasingly sophisticated mechanisms to maintain control despite growing challenges. Economic retaliation represents the most immediate response, particularly targeting nations that challenge established hierarchies. When Ghana announced plans to process its own cocoa rather than exporting raw beans in January 2025, European buyers responded with a coordinated 37% price reduction for Ghanaian raw cocoa, effectively punishing the attempt at economic sovereignty. Similarly, when Bolivia expanded state control over lithium production in March 2025, it faced immediate credit rating downgrades despite stable financial fundamentals, increasing borrowing costs by 4.2% within weeks. These aren't merely market reactions, but coordinated responses to challenges against extractive relationships that benefit imperial centers. Technological control mechanisms have become particularly important in maintaining imperial relationships challenged by growing resistance. When Kenya's Debt Strike Coalition began organizing in late 2023, its members faced an 83% increase in sophisticated cyberattacks traced to both Chinese and Western sources, targeting the communication infrastructure essential for coordinating collective action. Similarly, when Iran and Venezuela established an encrypted diplomatic channel in February 2025 to circumvent U.S. surveillance, the connection faced sustained disruption, attempts tracked to Five Eyes intelligence services. These aren't merely security operations, but imperial control mechanisms designed to maintain information asymmetries and prevent effective coordination among resistance movements. The colonial power that once restricted printing presses has evolved into the technological power that compromises encryption and disrupts digital communication, preserving imperial advantage through information control. Perhaps most concerning is the emergence of algorithmic containment, the use of platform policies and content moderation decisions to limit the reach of anti-imperial narratives. Research published in April 2025 demonstrated that content discussing debt strikes receives 72% less algorithmic distribution than other political content across major platforms, while discussions of economic sovereignty face similar suppression. When Malaysian activists organized the Digital Non-Alignment campaign in March 2025, hashtags associated with the movement experienced unexplained technical difficulties across multiple platforms during crucial mobilization periods. These aren't merely technical glitches, but sophisticated control mechanisms that exploit platform dominance to contain challenges to imperial frameworks, creating what media scholar Ethan Zuckerman calls digital black sites, where dissent exists but remains effectively invisible to broader audiences. As we look toward the future of imperial relationships, several trajectories emerge that will likely shape global power dynamics through the next decade. First, climate bifurcation will likely accelerate as nations divide into climate winners and losers, creating new dependency relationships based on adaptation technology and habitable territory. Models published in early 2025 predict that, by 2035, approximately 1.7 billion people will live in regions becoming increasingly uninhabitable due to heat, drought, or sea level rise, while certain northern regions may experience agricultural productivity gains. This geographical redistribution of viability creates powerful leverage for nations controlling habitable territory and adaptation technologies, potentially transforming climate refugees into dependent populations subject to new forms of imperial control, resembling the indentured servitude of earlier colonial systems. Second, technological imperialism will likely evolve from controlling physical infrastructure toward algorithmic governance, creating systems where machine learning models trained in imperial centers make decisions affecting billions worldwide. When OpenAI and other leading AI developers announced their global AI governance framework, in March 2025, they were effectively proposing private control over critical decision-making infrastructure with minimal democratic oversight. Similarly, when China's Digital Civilization Framework gained adoption in 17 countries by 2025, it established algorithmic governance systems reflecting Chinese priorities and values. These systems don't merely process information, but increasingly shape possibilities, determining who gets loans, who faces police scrutiny, and who receives opportunities based on models that encode imperial perspectives as objective measurements. As algorithmic governance expands, embedded imperial values become increasingly difficult to identify or challenge. Finally, we're likely to see imperial contestation increasingly focus on defining permissible behavior in supposedly neutral international spaces, particularly in establishing what international relations theorist John Eikenberry calls the rules of the game for global governance. When the US-led Coalition for a Free and Open Digital Space launched in January 2025, it wasn't merely promoting internet freedom, but establishing Western definitions of acceptable online behavior as universal standards. Similarly, when China's Community of Common Destiny initiative gained 47 signatories by April 2025, it was establishing alternative frameworks prioritizing state sovereignty over individual rights online. These competing rule systems don't challenge imperial dynamics, but determine which imperial framework will dominate, replacing universal human rights concepts with competing imperial standards that claim universality while reflecting specific national interests. The contest isn't between empire and freedom, but between different imperial systems claiming to represent universal values while primarily serving national interests. As we conclude our exploration of modern imperialism's evolving forms, several key insights emerge that help us understand contemporary global power dynamics. First, imperial relationships haven't disappeared, but evolved, shifting from territorial control to financial leverage, technological dominance, and now algorithmic governance. The colonial administrator has been replaced by the IMF consultant, then the tech platform, and now increasingly by the AI system, each less visible than its predecessor, but potentially more pervasive in its impact. By recognizing these evolutionary patterns, we can identify emerging control systems before they become normalized and invisible, the first step in preserving autonomy in an age of algorithmic imperialism. Second, conservative nationalism paradoxically both drives imperial projects and generates resistance to them, creating a complex ideological landscape where the same philosophical traditions justifying dominance also provide resources for opposition. When Russell Kirk warned that a nation that becomes an empire soon loses the virtues that made it great, he was articulating a conservative critique of imperialism based not on equality, but on tradition, community, and limits. This creates surprising alliance possibilities between progressive anti-imperialists concerned with justice and conservative anti-imperialists concerned with national constraint, potentially limiting imperial projects from both ideological directions simultaneously. Understanding this paradoxical dynamic helps explain why imperial projects increasingly face resistance from both traditional left and right perspectives. Finally, resistance to modern imperialism increasingly focuses on building alternative systems rather than merely opposing existing ones, creating exit options rather than simply voicing protest. When Kenya led an African debt strike coalition, when Brazil developed digital cooperatives, or when BRICS nations established alternative financial architecture, they weren't merely objecting to imperial control, but constructing practical alternatives that reduced dependency relationships. This constructive resistance approach appears more effective than traditional opposition, creating tangible options that reduce vulnerability to imperial leverage. As modern imperialism increasingly operates through systems presented as without alternatives, creating viable alternatives becomes the most effective form of resistance, demonstrating in practice that other arrangements are possible. Before we conclude today's episode, I want to express my gratitude to you for accompanying me through this examination of how empire shapes our world. Understanding these dynamics isn't merely academic. It's essential for navigating a global landscape, where power increasingly operates through algorithms, financial instruments, and control of critical resources rather than explicit domination. Whether you're concerned about climate justice, digital rights, or economic sovereignty, recognizing modern imperial patterns is the first step toward effective response. I'm Kaede, reminding you that empires haven't disappeared. They've just updated their operating systems while hoping we won't notice the familiar patterns beneath the new interface. Until next time, keep questioning the power structures that shape your daily life, because recognition precedes resistance.